Today on Joe's Geek Show, we're going to be talking about the OGN Power Rangers Sins of the Future from Boom Studios.
Power Rangers,
What's going on, and welcome to Joe's Geek Show, the video series where we talk comics. And if you're new and like to support the channel, you can do so by hitting that like button, clicking that subscribe button, and sharing. And with that, time for Time Force. And this book is written by Matthew Erman, with story by Trey Moore, art by Giuseppe Cafaro, colors by Francesco Segala, letters by Dukeshire, and cover by Diego Galindo. And this story begins with Jen, the Time Force Pink Ranger, as she is running and battling what looks like other Time Force officers before running into the trio of Ransik, Nadira, and Frax. The book then cuts to the past where Wes and Eric are battling cycloblots, believed to be the last remnants of Ransik's army, as Jen appears helping in their dispatch. Wes and Jen then proceed to use their remaining time to go out for lunch before she is summoned back to her time to meet with Captain Logan about what she believes to be a promotion, but turns out to be a reassignment to the new Hyperforce division. And just for a little quick commentary, Power Rangers Hyperforce is a tabletop RPG where they actually do live episodes on Twitch. You even have Aaron Cahill, who played Jen in Power Rangers Time Force, as well as Paul Schreier, who played Bulk. And I don't want to say it's a popular part of the Power Rangers fandom, but it has been seeping into canon over the years. Knowing she has to make a choice to break it off with Wes, she heads back to the past where Wes takes her to the old clock tower, which had been previously destroyed during the final battle of Power Rangers Time Force. However, as Wes explained, it just appeared, which Jen notes as an anomaly and impossible. It's then that the tower is once again destroyed as Wes and Jen are attacked by a black Time Force Ranger. After a brief battle, Jen has to call in Eric as Wes had been injured. Realizing she has no other choice, Jen decides to break it off with Wes before promptly returning back to her time, where she heads to Katie's, the Yellow Time Force Ranger's apartment, and is attacked by the other Rangers who had branded her a murderer and a traitor, claiming she's the one that killed Alex. Jen has no choice but to fight when Nadira shows up and takes Jen through a portal where she explains that she's from the future and time has changed. Basically, it's an alternate timeline. We then go back to Wes's present briefly as they're summoned to their HQ, as Wes and Eric are being told that there are ripples in time happening and something big is coming, when suddenly, the Black Time Force Ranger shows up and attacks. Cutting back to the future, Nadira continues to explain their predicament and shows Jen a letter from Wes saying not to come back for him, and that he's in his last moments as the Black Ranger is attacking. Jen decides that Wes must be the key to the time anomalies and they need to break into Time Force headquarters. As Jen and Nadira do this, we get a quick one-page retelling of Alex's fall at the hands of Ransik, with narration by someone else, before returning to Jen and Nadira, as Time Force HQ is covered in various time anomalies called chronoskips. And chronoskipping is explained as all forms of time that involve this particular area sort of converging in and on itself, causing these slight ghosting effects, almost like a pre-recorded tape that's being played. We then get a replay of the first page to give us context that this is where the book actually began. It's then that the Black Time Force Ranger shows up, in which a fight ensues between her and Jen, with it being revealed that the Black Ranger is none other than Alex's sister Syra, who blames Jen for Alex's death, indifference, and personality upon his return. Jen apologizes and says she's not causing the ripples in time, and they decide to team up when Captain Logan appears attempting to arrest Jen and tells her that she killed Wes, which cut Alex from the timeline. During this time, Syra brings up that every time Alex dies, she goes somewhere outside of time and space. Captain Logan calls it the Black Site, in that it's supposed to be classified, as Nadira disarms the captain. Nadira then contacts her father, who's the director of Time Force in the future, after recognizing that Syra's morpher as the work of Dr. Ferrix, aka Frax. She requests information on the dock and the Black Site, as Ransik responds that the Black Site isn't the name of the place, but its designation. Its real name is Outpost 1. Jen, Nadira, and Syra make their way to Outpost 1 and run into creatures called the Time Ravaged, as the trio get inside the only building safely. Upon their exploration, they discover that this place is where Dr. Ferrix conducted his experiments, going as far as trying to tap into the morphing grid, and even before that, having altered human DNA, thus creating the mutant Venomax. They then discover a robot that calls itself Frix, a machine Ferrix created and imprinted his intelligence onto, revealing that it had been the one creating the time anomalies in order to change history. Syra attacks, only for Frix to open a time portal to the prehistoric times and throw her in, allowing Jen enough time to jump in and destroy Frix. Jen then notices the black chronomorpher on the ground, realizing that she's in a time paradox and has to give the morpher to Syra at an earlier point in time, which she does. This apparently fixes the timeline, as before Jen leaves Outpost 1, an older Syra appears, saying everything worked out, and she destroys the morpher. The book concludes with Jen taking Wes to Outpost 1, saying that this is where they can meet and have their relationship, since it exists outside of time and space. And holy crap, was this book confusing. I get that time travel can be a very complicated process, especially if you don't take the time to convey or explain the rules about how time travel works within this universe, as well as when you're throwing in things like alternate timelines and paradoxes. You can be left with more questions than answers. For example, you have the character Alex, who wasn't even really in the story other than in passing mention, and as well as a flashback sequence. We get continuous mention of how he died, but then time changed, so he came back to life, but he was different, and it just kind of went along in such a way where I even had to wonder, wait, is he even alive in this timeline? Because even before time was essentially altered when Jen went back, he was still seemingly nowhere to be found in the story, which I would say is kind of sad considering he is an important element. There's also all the times the Black Force Time Ranger attacks Wes throughout the story, which after we find out that she's Alex's sister, therefore also a descendant of Wes, attacking him makes no sense. Because if you manage to kill him before he has a chance to pass along his genetic material, shall we say, you run the risk of wiping yourself from existence. Both you and your brother, who you're doing all this for in the first place. Then it could just be me, but after Syra's identity is revealed, Jen's dialogue suggests that Jen's trying to say that Syra looks like her. Because when you do compare the two side by side, facially they share a lot of similarities. Albeit this is also true for the Nadira character, but her looks don't come into question within the story. I mean, Jen could just be shocked and she's trying to say more so, you look like Alex's sister, but that doesn't really strike me as something she would say, and the implications based on the way the face was framed and how zoomed in she was left me with the idea that more so Jen was trying to say that she looks like her. Which, if that is the case, has a whole brand new set of implications involved, furthering confusing the relationship with like Jen and Wes and Alex and now Syra. Because we gotta remember that at one point, Alex and Jen were engaged, and if Jen looks like Syra or vice versa, that means in some weird way, Alex might have been attracted to his sister. And let's say, just for the sake of argument, that Wes and Jen actually did have kids together, which would mean that more than likely, Jen would be the ultra super great grandmother of both Alex and Syra. Wait, talk about keeping it all in the family. And the story also just jumps all over the place between time and space. I mean, part of Time Force lore is that Time Force can't just go jumping through time willy-nilly because there could be catastrophic consequences to them doing so. But here, it seems like Jen's doing it like every other Sunday in order to go see Wes, and then when things really hit the fan and people start blaming her for all of the things going wrong with the chronal skips and time anomalies and alternate realities, she's just like, that's not me, I'm not doing that. And I'm like, well, how do you know? You're literally going back and impeding on a time that is not yours. Even your captain during the briefing says they're monitoring changes that are happening every time you go back in time. And the book does try its best to differentiate between all the timelines, which that in itself isn't so much the problem. Where a lot of the problem comes from is the fact that we just cut to these different times or different places. There's no real transition between the pages. I mean, 1 minute Jen is in the future and then bop, now she's in the past. One such spot, of course, would be the very beginning where we see Jen and it's like, okay, is she on the job currently or is this taking place at another point in time? But we don't really find out about that until halfway through the story. Instead, we get 1 page of Jen in action, and then we cut 1,000 years before in Wes's time. And the annotation of 1,000 years prior doesn't really tell us what we need to know. What we want to know is where that first page happened. What probably should have been done with, which also would have been a lot more simplistic, would have been saying something like 3 days prior and then annotate beneath it that we're in the past. It would better have let us readers know that this is the true start of the story and the first page is just basically a prelude of things to come. When it comes to character interaction, this is also a subject that could be rather hit and miss. Whereas things like Wes and Jen going out on a date was nice and really did feel like those two characters. Whenever Jen had interactions with someone else or Nadira had interactions with characters, it felt kind of awkward. One such moment was when Nadira was contacting her dad, who is the director of Time Force in the future, aka Rancic, Time Force's previous villain, later reformed and turned human via Wild Force. There's an awkward moment where she asks him for information on Dr. Ferrix. He gets upset, saying, "Why are you asking me to break protocol?" But then completely changes his tone to nice because, okay, yeah, he'll do anything for his daughter, and then asks her, "What is it that you need?" And she says information on Dr. Ferrix, and he gets upset all over again as if it didn't happen the first time. And situations of characters being calm one minute and irrational the next do happen quite often through the book. When it comes to Syra, I also think her character is also all over the place because she spends a better part of the book trying to kill Jen because she so believes that she is the source of all her problems, as well as the problems that involve the chronal skips and the time anomalies. And then when she is face to face with Jen, she goes, "Now I'm gonna get you for all the terrible things you did. You're guilty, you're guilty, you're guilty." And then Jen just goes, "That wasn't me, I didn't do that." And Syra's just like, "Oh, okay, let's team up." Yeah, like you just didn't spend half the book trying to kill her. And then we get the inclusion of Dr. Ferrix, aka Frax, and at some point in this book, Frix. And it's such a shame what happens because this character was one of the greatest characters in Time Force, mostly because of the tragedy that befell him. He had a very sympathetic story. He was just a humble scientist trying to make his way in the world with his inventions. When he sees a poor man, helps him out, and the man betrays him. This man turns out to be Rancic, who mortally wounds Dr. Ferrix, and Dr. Ferrix has no choice but to put his consciousness inside of a robot body, where he decides to team up with Rancic until such a time where he can betray him and get his revenge, leading to the unfortunate result of Rancic finding out about this and reprogramming Frax, completely killing the man and only leaving the machine. So much for sympathy. Why not just make him a mad scientist who worked for Time Force, got fired, and decided to have this place called Outpost 1 where he would run experiments on people, on machines, who even created the mutant Venomark. Because Venomark is the mutant that attacks and poisons Rancic in order for Dr. Ferrix to find him in the first place, make a cure for the guy, and essentially start the entire story. That doesn't just change the character of Dr. Ferrix, that changes the context of the entire Time Force series, as everything that had happened, including the show itself, was all on him. Takes the tragedy off his character, it makes a huge change in canon, as well as takes the pressure off Jen and Wes to come to an ultimate decision and conclusion about their relationship. Because once Jen pretty much figures out, oh, well, it's not me, so I can have my relationship with this guy from the past. And to continue with characters, where was Wes? I mean, he does have a few pages, but for a guy who's taking up a good chunk of space on the cover, you would expect him to be in the story a little bit more than he was. Even the back of the book says, "A love that crosses all of time and space," which tells me that this is essentially going to be a love story. But it turns out to be more of Jen's story, and Wes just gets sidelined. And to continue on with the relationship, it literally ends with them more or less getting what they want to a point, because as long as they stay in Outpost 1, which is outside of time and space, he can go back to his time whenever he wants, she can go back to her time whenever she wants. So it's kind of like, here's a neutral ground where nothing really matters, but at the end of the day, what did that really solve? Because you still have to go back to your time. One of the things that makes their relationship so memorable and so engaging is that it's a forbidden love. It's one that's not meant to last. Should they continue down this path, there could be negative consequences to tampering with time. And here, the story looks like it's trying to essentially give them an out, but a decision is still gonna have to be made. As a side note, we also wouldn't be here if Time Force actually enforced their own policies of wiping the memories of those that have been through time in the first place. And what about the time ravaged? That was just kind of left open. Were they the actual inhabitants slash people that exist in between time and space? Are they leftover remnants of Dr. Ferrick's experiments? Jen decides that Outpost 1 can be a ranger base for pretty much all the Power Rangers. So does that mean she somehow cleared out the time ravaged? Because they were violent. Wouldn't be much of a ranger base if it was constantly under attack. So what became of them? Also, as the book stated, the only way to get to Outpost 1 was to get in a ship, start time travel, and then you kind of had to ram the wall between time and space in order to get there. So did they figure out an alternate way to get there? Do they have to ram their ship every time? We don't know, because we don't ever see how she got back there. And a million other questions that can arise from this book. And then also, I keep thinking about the characters and the cast as a whole, and despite it being a rather large cast, this book still felt empty. I mean, you had the other Time Force Rangers, kind of, but they were relatively dismissed pretty early on. Now, I understand the book, after reading it, was mainly meant to be about Jen, Siren, Nadira, but I also keep thinking that's also kind of true for the Psychopath, where the main characters really were essentially Andros and Perone. But that book also still managed to keep the other Rangers in the loop, keep reminding us that yes, they are still here, they are still working to help Andros and save Perone, and they are present both in the final conflict and the story's conclusion. Here, characters are readily introduced and dismissed at the story's convenience rather than letting the characters drive the story. When it comes to the artwork, I do have a few discrepancies, one of which I already annotated with the whole issue with Jen and Sarah maybe looking like each other, but because of the sameness across pretty much all of the female characters, it created some narrative issues. Other than the main line work isn't bad, because this is the same guy who did the artwork for Soul of the Dragon, a Power Rangers book that I actually really liked. The action when happening I thought was pretty engaging, but my issue was they always ended really fast. Because there's so much happening in this book, it's always looking to get to the next part as quickly as possible. So when you do have some really interesting action sequences going on, they almost always end abruptly. As such, it makes the book read quite sporadic, and that is to its detriment. But to give the story some credit, there were a lot of good ideas here, such as the Black Time Force Ranger. Hey, anytime you're adding another Ranger to the mix and deepening the Power Rangers lore, as long as it's done well, it's a very welcome addition. The idea of having Jen come back to an alternate reality and being a fugitive could have made for a really cool story, where maybe Wes caught wind of it somehow, found a way to the future in order to help her, in sort of the reverse Days of Futures Past scenario. Also, exploring the reformed Rancic as the director of Time Force in the future. I mean, yeah, I would love to know more about that. Presenting questions of how far Jen and Wes can take their relationship could also make for a very good story, as they're dealing with the ramifications on the time stream as a result of their relationship, which was, I guess, supposed to be the overall point to this particular story, but it kind of got lost and botched as soon as we found out that it was Fricks causing the time anomalies. And of course, there are quite a bit of Easter eggs thrown into the book, like with the mention of the Hyperforce division as a call out to Power Rangers Hyperforce. You've got Outpost 1, which was a Ranger base that was used in the Shattered Grid event, which tells us that this book takes place before the Shattered Grid event. Also, one of Dr. Ferrick's experiments was said to be from Eltar, the same planet as Zordon, who was the big talking head guy in the original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers TV series. Ferrick's even calls him Z. I hope the story isn't trying to say that that particularly was Zordon, because then that just creates a whole other list of problems. Ultimately, this story could have been great, should have been great, as it continues what most consider the greatest season of Power Rangers in history. With all the ideas that the writers threw onto the table, I think that had they cherry-picked 1 or 2 plot lines and fleshed those out, then yeah, this could have been a more focused book and a lot smoother read. But although I was deeply disappointed with this book, what did you think about Power Rangers Sins of the Future? Did you like it? Did you not? Please tell me your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you like this video, I'd love it if you'd smash that like button, share it with some friends, subscribe if you're not subscribed already, and ring that notification bell for more comic book content. And if you're wondering what to watch next, consider one of these 2 videos. Alright, take care, have a great day, and as always, stay geeky.